Hello, I'm Aimee Ng, curator at the Frick Collection in New York, and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. We at the Frick are gearing up for the opening of Frick Madison, which will be happening very soon. And there you will be able to see this painting, which I'll be talking to you about tonight, among many of the treasures of the Frick's collection in a way you've never seen them before. The Frick's members, of course, will have access to the galleries at Frick Madison before anyone else. So if you are interested in becoming a member, please click the link in the description below. In honor of the spectacular headdress worn by the subject of this painting, which seems to be a tiara made of fresh orange blossoms, the complementary cocktail tonight is an orange blossom. This is a refreshing drink made of gin, sweet vermouth, and fresh orange juice. Cheers. To some people, this portrait of the Comtesse Daru by the painter Jacques-Louis David is considered a lesser-known work in the Frick's collection. And this may be in part because the artist, Jacques-Louis David, leader of the neoclassical school of painting in France in the late 18th century, early 19th century, is best known for history paintings, these sort of monumental classical scenes like his very famous Oath of the Horatii. Both the self-portrait on the left of David and his Oath of the Horatii are today at the Louvre. Some associate David very much with the French Revolution, art of Napoleonic culture, and this is very true. And the artist himself was embroiled in the political chaos of this time. He was imprisoned himself, and at the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the artist too was exiled from France. He fled France for Belgium, where he died in 1825. David's neoclassicism and this sort of style of painting in general might be characterized by classicizing, moralizing subject matter presented in a style that might be described the same way, classicizing, moralizing. So for example, the painting of the Oath of the Horatii presents this episode of early Roman history in which two cities are going to war, Rome and Alba. But instead of the whole cities going to war, each city chooses one family to represent the city and they will battle it out. And in this scene, three brothers from the Horatii family are swearing an oath to take on this burden. They will fight the Curatii family from the other city. One problem is that the families have by this time intermarried. And so the mourning women at the right represent the fact that no matter who wins, there will be tragic losses on both sides. And this is a painting in which the style echoes a sort of self-sacrifice, a sort of upstanding character that is being promoted here, these sort of clear contours, the geometry of the classical architecture, the balance, the sort of strong shadows, there's almost simplicity of this scene in terms of composition and balance. And some have positioned this type of painting as a direct response to, or even outright rejection of, the popular style of painting in France that came before, Rococo painting, epitomized in works of art like Fragonard's Progress of Love series. I'm showing you one of these that are, of course, now at the Frick Collection. This is a series, of course, commissioned by the last mistress of the King of France, Louis XV, Madame du Barry, in the early 1770s. And this comparison makes it very clear, from subject to style, one sort of pink and fluffy and flouncy, almost to represent the Ancien Regime themselves and their wigs and their, copious garments and frills and their luscious gardens, talking about love. Pitted against the sort of strength and virility and sort of enlightenment of the figures represented in David's painting. And some like to draw, a very clean divide between the Rococo period and the neoclassical period right at the year 1789, so divided by the French Revolution. Of course, it's not so simple. both of the paintings that I'm showing you right now were produced before 1789, before the real events of the French Revolution. So as I said, early 1770s for the Fragonard painting, and 1784 for David's Oath of the Horatii. So the onset of neoclassicism to with some degree a change of taste even among the Ancien Regime, even among the monarchy of France before the fall. My colleague Xavier has spoken at length in other episodes of Cocktails with the Curator and elsewhere about the Fragonard pictures and the fact that Madame du Barry, already 20 years before the storming of the Bastille in 1789, had rejected Fragonard's Rococo paintings, and she had them replaced with much more neoclassical style paintings by the artist Marie-Joseph Vien, who was the teacher of David. And David's Oath of the Horatii, too, was in fact a royal commission. This was painted for the King of France, Louis XVI, who, of course, was executed during the Reign of Terror in the 1790s. So neoclassicism was to some degree a change in taste already from the Ancien Regime, but it did, of course, become the language of the revolution and particularly of Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is David's very famous portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps. This is the first of 5 versions he did, this one at Malmaison. And Napoleon he appointed David as first painter to the emperor. And of course, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804. And in this capacity, David painted many things. And one of the most prominent is this monumental, massive canvas depicting this event of 1804 of the crowning of Napoleon and his wife Josephine as Emperor and Empress of France. This is some 33 feet wide, some 20 feet tall, really extraordinary, even just in its size. And this is today at the Louvre. Under David's brush, this modern event takes on the gravity and monumentality of a moment of ancient history, for example. It takes on the sort of the gravity and seriousness of what David had been painting before. And although there are many, many, many figures here, and although this is meant to depict an event, David approached each one of these figures with almost obsessive attention to detail and likeness. He really wanted to get everybody just right. And so there's a very convincing sense of everyone who was there, exactly what was happening. But don't be fooled. Just like any work of art, there is embellishment here, there's invention, there's a little bit of editing. For example, people who did not even attend the coronation are pictured in this scene. So for example, most famously, Napoleon's own mother did not attend the coronation. She was angry with Napoleon at the time, but Napoleon requested to the artist David that he paint her into the scene. So near obsessive attention to the likeness and appearance of this moment in each individual. This could be considered an enormous group portrait with some invention and embellishment. As you can imagine, this took David some time to do and some significant effort. He finishes it in 1807. Years later, 1810, he still has not been paid for it. And by 1810, Napoleon has already divorced Josephine, and he's already getting ready to marry his next wife. So David's chances of being paid are sort of waning as Napoleon moves on from what is being commemorated specifically at the center of this composition. So David appeals to someone very close to Napoleon. And this person is Pierre, Comte Daru. And Daru held many positions under Napoleon's government and empire. One of them was the master of the imperial household. And in this capacity, he would have been responsible for, or he had the control or ability to pay debts like that owed to David. And he, in fact, does come through for David. The artist is paid finally for this monumental work. And for those of you who have visited this painting at the Louvre, you've visited it in a gallery and a pavilion that is actually named after Comte Daru. This is the Galerie Daru. This, of course, was named and built years after the death of Daru, after David, after Napoleon. This was built 1863, the expansion of the Louvre under Napoleon III. But these pavilions and galleries were named after people like Daru, who were very close to Napoleon and under that First Empire. And so, interestingly, this painting in Daru will always be intertwined for history. The artist sought some way to repay Comte Daru for accomplishing this for him. And he sought to create a gesture of thanks. And the best way that he could do that, of course, was with his art. And so he decided to secretly paint a portrait of Daru's wife, Alexandrine, the Comtesse Daru. This is, of course, the painting at the Frick. And he surprised the Count by installing it in the finished portrait of his wife in the family salon upon Daru's return home one day. In fact, the artist was able to paint her in secret because Daru was away from Paris for some time in the spring of 1810. He was actually with Napoleon, helping him prepare to meet and to marry his next wife, Marie-Louise. When Daru came back from this trip, he was delighted with this painting. She was delighted with this painting. For an artist who was so well known, who was so prominent in France, and particularly well known for these monumental historical works, propaganda almost, it was a rare treat then, and it still is now, to have by the hand of this artist something so much more intimate and personal, like this portrait of the Comtesse Daru. And really, what's not to like? She's so charming, that, light smile, that almost ridiculous headdress of orange blossoms. Here's a closer look at it with her ringlets of brown hair just peeking out from the bottom. And she's wearing a matching set of earrings and necklace. They have been described by many as emeralds. But the size of the stones really would make this jewelry almost inconceivably expensive. So perhaps they are jade, maybe more likely some kind of green chalcedony. Whatever they are, this detail allows us to appreciate that sort of careful touch of David's brush to show us that each stone is sort of encrusted, encircled with diamonds, and interspersed with pearls. She is wearing the fashion of the First Empire in France. And the style of dress with a very high waist right under the bust is still today referred to as empire waist, of course, in reference to this First Empire of France in the early 19th century. Of course, the fashion of this moment was also a sort of evocation of ancient Greek fashion as well. And just a closer look at the neckline shows, the satin dress is also lined with some muslin. Again, David's interest in showing the differences in texture, the reflective surface of the satin in various ways. Really marvelous attention to these details. This was a fashion of dress that called for bare arms and that left women vulnerable to cold. And so a necessary accessory was a cashmere shawl. These were imported from the East. They were extremely expensive, and they really were, especially in the early years of this fashion, a sign of enormous wealth and an enormous luxury. She's sitting in what appears to be a mahogany chair, so that you see the color of that wood. And of course, mahogany was being imported from the European colonies in the Caribbean into France. And it's decorated with a gilt bronze on either side, but we can only see one, gilt bronze sphinx, which was common enough for empire-style furniture of the time. But one of my favorite details, and which is why I'm showing you that sphinx head to the left, one of my favorite details is David's attention to the reflection of the red pattern of the shawl against the cheek of this gilt bronze sphinx. This detail allows us to just get a sense of the change in texture, the illusion of the change in texture under David's brush, from the satin to the cashmere with the sort of loose ends, the very, very fine skin, and just at her fingertips lingers the handle of a fan. And to me, that small detail almost captures the essence of the whole portrait, this sort of relaxed, at home, very approachable, very intimate painting, the opposite of the propaganda that David was used to painting outside of this home. The artist signed it to the left, I hope you can see that in black, El David, 1810, and he signed it at exactly 4 o'clock on the 14th of March, 1810. We know that because on that day, at that time, the Comtesse had company. And he recorded it in his diary that this happened, that the artist finished the portrait and signed it at 4 o'clock on that day. This is a man who was in love with the Comtesse, although the rumors of them actually having an affair have not been substantiated. This man was the famous author Marie-Henri Beyle, better known by his pen name Stendhal, author of Le Rouge et le Noir, The Red and the Black, and The Charterhouse of Parma, among other things. He was a cousin of Comte Daru. And although he didn't particularly like his cousin, and he refers to him many times as the terrible Daru, Stendhal came down to Paris from his native Grenoble in order to take advantage of his cousin's position and power in Napoleon's circle in order to secure his own position and power. And he is eventually successful in doing so. He becomes appointed auditor with a healthy salary. And in the meantime, he falls in love with his cousin's wife. We get to know more things about Alexandrine through the writings, the personal writings of Stendhal. So he records a lot in his journal about her over a number of years, that he is infatuated with her. And he writes one description of her around the time of this portrait, the following year, that almost seems to describe David's portrait in words. He describes her as a woman of 27, rather stout, with dark chestnut hair, black and very thick eyebrows, small, quite sparkling eyes, who likes to be active. Her appearance reveals a warm temperament. Her features reveal a forceful, frank, and jolly character. It's interesting to note that for somebody who is in love with her for some years, he never describes her really as beautiful. But there's something else about her that he is finding so appealing and so attractive and compelling. But one can get a little annoyed or irritated with Stendhal when one reads too much of his writings, especially when he touches on his place and whether or not there's this strange written debate that he has with himself about whether or not he can have Alexandrine, however you want to interpret to have her. And he's sort of debating her qualities. And in this one of these passages, he laments, she's not as fun anymore at balls. She doesn't go, she doesn't stay out dancing till 4 a.m. anymore. And when one remembers that by this point, even by 1810, when David is painting her in the spring of 1810, she has 6 children and she's 27 years old. When Stendhal is writing this, debate with himself about her, she's pregnant again, and so this is a common enough experience for women through history. Let's say she dies 5 years after this portrait is painted at the age of 31, while giving birth to her 12th child. She loved this portrait of her, and even the week after David finishes it and signs it, she writes him a letter and she thanks the artist, saying that she might be the one who loves it the most. Of everybody who's seen it, she might love it the most. And she's so moved by it and so happy with it that she actually sends to him with her letter a gift. And we don't know what the gift is, but it is of such value and maybe of such expense, that the artist is embarrassed by it. He says, this was supposed to be a gift, and now she has given me back this thing. But it sort of gives you a sense of how much she really enjoyed seeing herself presented in this way. Again, we don't know very much more about her. She did not live a very long life, but we do know that she loved this portrait. When the trustees of the Frick collection acquired this painting in the 1930s, it joined another famous Comtesse in the Frick's collection, and that is, of course, Ing's portrait of the Comtesse d'Aussonville, which was acquired in the 1920s. And of course, both of these paintings were acquired after the death of Henry Clay Frick, under the leadership, really, of his daughter, Helen Clay Frick. Ing's portrait on the right has very often been referred to as the poster girl of the Frick. I've spoken to some degree about this portrait in another episode of Cocktails with the Curator. And seeing them together, I think, brings a few things home. I mean, David's painting is nowhere near as famous as Ing's painting, but when you remember that David was the teacher of Ing, and Ing's portrait on the right was painted some 30 years later, you can see where Ing got some of his lessons from, this sort of really obsessive attention to naturalistic detail. Showing these women amid all of their fineries, glowing amid all their fineries. And this is something that Ing, I think, takes to an even higher key, to a greater degree. But the comparison also, I think, for me at least, drives home how warm and how human David presents his sitter, very much unlike how Ing presents the Comtesse d'Aussonville, impossibly beautiful. And as I've described before, impossible even in her anatomy. There's no way her elbow could possibly have been that low, but it made for a much more beautiful composition. David, instead, I find it very convincing that the Comtesse Daru actually looked like this, that she sat and looked like this. She's very approachable, very at ease. One doesn't get a sense that she's been completely contorted or distorted. To me, she has one of the most friendliest faces at the Frick. She's one of the most sympathetic people that I meet in the Frick's galleries looking out from these paintings. I think I know who I would prefer to sit down with for a orange blossom cocktail. I wonder who you would prefer. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Cocktails with the Curator. We'll see you next time.